there's this commonality with nature that we share in being circadian beings, that once I started using this version of time, I felt something in common with the pot plant in my studio, that we both had these kind of rhythms that were set by daylight and nothing to do with numbers. Like, time's not a numerical phenomenon. And that level of kind of a shared reality really opened me up to a lot of kind of empathy with the living world and respect for it, or kind of duty of care for it as well, or even the rhythms of kind of the cycles of growth and dormancy.
You're listening to the Spaceship Earth podcast with me, Dan Burgess.
Welcome to the show. This is episode 30 of the Spaceship Earth podcast. In this episode, I'm in conversation with designer Ted Hunt. The Spaceship Earth podcast is where I'm having conversations with inspiring humans who are on a mission to reimagine, redesign and heal our world as we shift from industrial growth society and passive consumer culture to becoming crew on the Spaceship Earth, fully participating with all life in the co-creation of a more beautiful, life-sustaining world. It's where I'm asking, how might we thrive in a world that's alive? In this episode, I'm in conversation with designer Ted Hunt. Ted describes himself as a speculative, a discursive, critical designer, and you'll find out exactly what that is when we get into conversation. And his work really is exploring the kind of intersections between our ancient behavioural driven selves and our modern technologically driven selves. Yeah, exactly. You know you need to listen to this, don't you? And he's sort of exploring constantly this kind of the non-linear alternative paradigms, and examines the boundaries between subjective, objective and intersubjective interpretations and perspectives. Exactly. You really know you need to listen to this. He graduated from the Royal College of Art in 2016, and Ted is prolific in his work, always experimenting, always putting things out into the world to try and get kind of feedback and learning. I have a huge respect for this man. He's prolific in his work, massive heart, insanely curious, and the sort of designer I think we just would be amazing to see more of people like Ted. Sort of more of Ted without a doubt. But this kind of work that Ted's exploring is basically, in my sort of layman's terms, I would describe Ted's work as Ted puts work out which helps people challenge or see that a lot of these kind of deeply embedded assumptions and constructs that we live our lives by, and we sort of we organise ourselves as humanity on this planet, they are just that, constructs and ideas which have been created by humans at some point in the past, and we've been sort of somehow convinced that that's what reality is. And Ted's work tends to kind of help you see that actually we could see beyond these ideas. They are just constructs, they are just ideas. So at this moment in time, I believe people like Ted are really, really, really important in our culture, because they're helping us see that other ways are possible, better ways are possible. We can start to see how sort of damaging a lot of our assumptions are that we live by, and a lot of these constructs are. So, I'm really excited by this one. It was a great chat. I have to say a quick shout out as well to the folks at Acast who lent me a little studio, an amazing studio, proper studio up in London at the last minute to record this in. So big respect to them. So this was a slightly shorter episode. We probably could have spoken for about 14 hours, but we didn't. We kept it fairly tight. As is my ambition this year in 2020 is to really try and up the game on this podcast, to get the episodes flowing a bit more regularly. I'm going to keep it fairly tight here on the front and the back end, so I can get these out faster. So yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. If you like what you're hearing on the Spaceship Earth podcast, please either share it, give us a rating or a like on Apple Podcasts or whoever you're listening to. It really does help the podcast surface and travel to others, and it would be amazing if you could do that. It would take you literally a few seconds. If you want to get in touch, you can drop me a line at dan@spaceship.earth. You can get us on Instagram at thespaceship.earth. Really hoping that 2020 is a year of of beautiful shifts for everyone. So let's cut straight to it now. This is episode 30 on the Spaceship Earth with Ted Hunt. Ted, welcome to the Spaceship Earth podcast.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Good to see you. I mean, you know, you see my updated studio in central London.
Yeah, we're very spaceship-esque today, actually.
We are. I have to say, I'm very grateful to Acast. And I feel like I've gone up a notch at the start of 2020. I'm not in a shed. We're actually in a proper podcasting studio,
Soundproofed room.
I know.
There's a glass window going through to where the sound engineer would be.
Exactly. So I'm hoping this is a sign of the year to come that the prototype of the Spaceship podcast is now.
Yeah.
You know, we're into a different phase. But I have a feeling. I have a feeling that might not be the case. But anyway, thanks for finding the time for today. Now we're in sort of a proper sort of commercial studio. We've actually got some time constraints. Quite often get on a ramble on this show, as listeners know. So we're going to get quite stuck in. Now I'm really interested to unpack some of the stuff you're up to right now. You've got a sort of fascinating history of what I would call experimentation. And you describe yourself as a speculative, discursive, critical designer.
Yeah,
I love that. Tell me about that.
Well, that's the of all the questions you probably asked me today. The what do you do? How do you describe yourself? Is my biggest fear. The one I got the big problem with. I was thinking maybe in the next hour it might even work that out. But yeah, on my website it says that I'm a speculative / critical / discursive designer.
Which, by the way, I totally agree with. I just want to know some more about it.
The notions, or not knowing what you do as a whole.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have that all the time. I was funny, actually. I was actually writing. I'm in the midst of writing my sort of 2020 intentions, because I like to sort of publicly put some stuff out. It helps me. Every time I do that, I tend to sort of get close to achieving some of them. But I was actually writing about this notion of not knowing what's my deep specialism, and how actually over the years it used to be quite problematic for me. But actually in the last, I would say the last year, actually, maybe a little bit longer, I've become really comfortable with this kind of pluralistic thing. And I sort of know that's why I am what I am. And there are threads. So anyway.
Yeah. But no, I think it's almost part of the problem we're in is the obsession with certainty and everyone having titles and formulas and missions and visions that are really singular. And maybe we'll get into this later, but it's kind of the problem I see is the difference between Newton's absolute reality in terms of science and Einstein's relativity. So the absolute reality is that everything is objective and can be measurable and quantified and and he had his vision of time that was absolute. Yeah. And then Einstein came along and found that time itself is relative and it's interjoined and it bends and gravity affects it. And I think, that in the phase we are in humanity at the minute, it was like we went with the age of enlightenment completely towards absolutism and everyone being really certain about things, and it hasn't paid off, and now we're getting a bit unsure. But back to what I do, the speculative,
so you're
critical.
Not just a designer.
I'm relatively a designer, but perhaps that could be a thing. I'm a relativity designer. I think maybe there will be more, or an uncertainty designer. People who are actually just really unsure about things. But the speculative, critical, discursive design has kind of come out of my background. I studied graphic design in university, and when I graduated it was the rise of the dot-com boom, so I went straight into website design and then more advertising, marketing, and then got a bit disillusioned with that, as a lot of people in our circles have been, and maybe a lot of your listeners, and end up getting ejected again. So I went off doing more freelance consultancy type stuff and my own self-initiated work, and then it got to the point where I decided to go back to study to the Royal College of Art, because I'd always wanted to go there and kind of missed it in the early part of my education. So I went back there as a mature student and studied a course called Design Interaction, and a professor called Anthony Dunn, who does really interesting work. And his notion is that what the question is, what happens if you decouple design from industry? If you think about design and creativity, a lot now, or people, they're just kids that are creative, and they follow that through university, they end up getting eaten up by advertising or design world. And it's such a kind of an industry focus area where you've got a client who wants to pay this creative person to add value to what they're doing via the process of design so they can make money. So his question was, what if you decouple design from that narrative, from industry, from money, what then can it do? And use it as a tool to speculate about alternative futures. So that really appealed to me.
Wow.
And then the critical notion is to take a lot of kind of thinking from critical thought, critical theory, which is normally embedded in books and literature and is quite cerebral, and then put that into design as kind of like an aesthetic. Well, exactly, yeah. So everyone knows what a designed object is in our everyday lives. So if you put some critical notions, kind of challenging consensus into those things, they might more easily adopt it and understand it than they otherwise would. And then the discursive point is that the end product of what I'm doing is intended for situations like this, for discussions, to have a conversation over it, and not to be a problem-solving tool or a money-making tool or a business venture or any of those things, again, where kind of design has classically got itself caught up into, either willingly or unwillingly. So they're conversation starters.
So it's like opening up something that can, these ideas that can open up, or interventions or things that can open up your thinking, your imagination to other possibilities.
Yeah, and not necessarily
and specialised.
Yeah, propose a single solution to this and frame it as a problem with a solution. Like sometimes they actually they raise more problems than they do solutions. Or there's people, you would look at that and say there's actually loads of contradictions tied up in what you're proposing, but in raising that, people are then considering the contradictions and then how they might be complicit in it, how I'm complicit in it, how everyone's complicit in it. So that's a bit on what I'm phrasing myself doing, and there's kind of a whole field of people practicing that type of design now, and it's been quite liberating and emancipating in a way that people have just been taking up this challenge of practicing design not for commercial aim. And it's not unique to this course that I was on, that people for eras have done design which was just kind of for their own self-exploration, but it's kind of it's getting quite a lot of traction now and quite a lot of attention, because it tends to be quite weird as well, a lot of its outputs.
Yeah, and I guess I guess that's the sort of if we were able to kind of sustain our core needs in the world as creatives, as designers, would we be more drawn to this type of practice? Are we drawn into kind of design for commercial gain because of the allure of? Obviously the need to kind of take part, participate in the economic system that we're in, but also do you get a sense that actually the work, this space that you're moving into now, is this something intuitively where many designers want to go, but actually just feel they can't because of economic constraints, the ability to be commercial?
I was thinking about this the other day, and I was reading about the ratchet effect. You know the ratchet effect? It's like or cultural ratchets. So things like the evolution of language or the written word is called cultural ratchet. So once you've discovered it, you can't go back. And it's kind of like you keep going up, up and up. So you imagine like a mechanical ratchet with the teeth on it, and then like the needle or lever holding the weight of the teeth. Right. And then you wind it up like you're going to jack a car up. So it holds away. Yeah. And the ratchet in terms of creative or design education. So even when you're in university level, you're still practicing a lot of kind of non-client, open-ended, quite theoretical work. But then you graduate and you're out in the world and you have to pay bills, and you take a job which is with an agency, or you're freelancing and you've got clients and they're paying you, and then suddenly you become in servitude because they've got the money and you're providing the service. And that seems like a really key ratchet, that you've gone over that point and now that's just a reality, and you had all of your ideals before that. And I think it was true for me that I graduated as a student with a lot of my own kind of idealistic worldview, and a lot of my work was very experimental, and I came to London to get a job, and I was going to interviews and people were like, this is all really nice, but I just can't see how you'd fit in here or how I'd deploy your skills. So then I had to start taking case studies for commercial projects and showing how I'd then interpret those, and then showing those in interviews, and people then got it. But then you get stuck in that system, and that just becomes normal. It's kind of clients pay you money to do this thing. So I think, for lots of designers, creative people, it's very usual up until the age of about 2021 maybe to be in the more speculative or critical side, or challenging norms, or doing things that had never been done before. Or even for kids, like, well, it was the quote about everyone starts off creative, everyone's an artist, the Picasso one, and then you get educated out of it.
Yeah, sort of conditioned, institutionalized to fit into this, this sort of certain thing.
So in some ways, it's a return to that. It's kind of exploring questions via the act of creativity, which is quite pleasurable as well. It's kind of, I see it as a hobby, and it's kind of something that I really enjoy doing.
Because I remember a few years back, actually, I remember you talking, you were very intentional. I think this was when you were doing when you'd gone to Royal College of Art, or prior to that, or even after, but you were very intentional about how you carve your time up. So the need to obviously, sustain yourself in the economic system. So there's a sort of like finding yourself, applying yourself to freelance projects which enable you to do that.
Yeah.
Being very intentional about creating the space you need to pursue this.
Yeah,
what you're doing now.
That's still going now, luckily. So I've got.
How do you find that switch, like when you're going back into the certain?
Increasingly hard, as we were talking about before we started. But my formula at the minute is if I do 3 months advertising consultancy, I'm a creative strategist. That essentially pays for 9 months of my own work, just self-initiated, and not having to worry about income, which, talking to a lot of people, I'm a very privileged formula, like 3 to 9. A lot of people don't get that, and a lot of that is to do with my overheads are quite low. I might get into this later, but I live in a canal boat on London, so I don't pay mortgages and electric bills and council tax and all those things. So I'd managed to, over a process of time, lower all my overheads, which then afforded me this ability to go back and study at Royal College of Art, and now to use this formula of doing the 3 months to 9. Sometimes there's a real kind of dialogue between the two, like almost knowing your enemy in a way, for the self-initiated versus the client-centric, or just kind of how the so-called real world works of money-making businesses and the kind of the pressures they're under, or the kind of motivators for them. Getting exposed to that doesn't allow me to kind of live in my own little bubble and be in an ivory tower and be really idealistic about things.
Yeah.
But sometimes my mind just doesn't fit into those spaces, or increasingly I'm having to turn work down because it just doesn't align with my own beliefs.
Yeah.
And
it's interesting that, isn't it? That whole thing of operating off a sort of deeper set of values or principles, and how you can, like I say, having to kind of have these feet in different camps, and working on the edges of these things. And like you say, the ability to sort of see a project rationally, and I can deliver something useful here, hopefully, to these people. But also increasingly, as the world around us becomes, it becomes more blooming obvious of where the problems lie. How long can we keep? How long are you able to keep doing that? And, it's an interesting one.
There was a phrase I heard recently that kind of frames it very well for me, and I think it's either from Greta or kind of Greta's generation of climate activists, and it's less bad isn't good.
Right.
And I feel like
I saw that in your narrative. Something in your narrative thing, which is about, what was it? Less bad isn't good, as we need these frames that we use. Still.
And I almost feel like being self-critically, like our Generation X, that kind of took over the baton from the baby boomers, who were like very profit-centric and put a lot of these systems in place, again, either knowingly or unknowingly. But the criticism of us is, I think maybe we went a bit less bad, that we just took systems that were very bad and we made them a bit less bad and made out that they're entirely good because of that, but they're still pretty deep into taking us to where we don't need to be. We're proposing, and the law, like the virtue signalling and greenwashing and everything that comes with that. And again, when you work in advertising and marketing, that's essentially what you're being asked to do, is make something look less bad, but propose that this is really good.
Yeah. Load of bollocks, basically. but there's also you could argue that even this frame, sustainability, right? Sustaining this thing right now, but actually we're trying to sustain the less bad model.
Yes, yeah.
Which is still hugely destructive.
Yeah.
On human level, planetary level, whatever.
Yeah.
Fascinating. So I want to dig into. You talk about this thing that always I love, which is investigating the intersections between our ancient behavioral-driven selves and our modern technologically driven selves. And there's some of your most recent stuff that I'd love to jump into. I think that really expresses that. But like the Circus Solar project. But just tell me about this kind of this place that you're exploring, this ancient self versus this kind of techno self. Tell me, where's that come from for you? And
there was almost, maybe like a lot of people's stories, there's almost the epiphany moment. So when I was freelancing, before I went to the Royal College of Art, and in the times I didn't have a contract, I'd just hang out in members' rooms and do my own projects in there. And I got a membership to the British Museum member room. And I was just working a lot from there and spending a lot of time in the British Museum and just almost picking up the aura of being around lots of ancient artifacts. And then I applied to go to the Royal College of Art, and it was on a course. It was to do with a lot of kind of future-focused work and kind of preferable futures, or realizing what the narratives of dystopian futures might look like. And I saw the relationship between what had happened in the past and what might happen in the future, and kind of the trajectory between the two, and how the very notion of innovation, or the Silicon Valley one, of kind of like something is like a pure new idea, and the obsession with newness and the world's first. Do you remember that whole, it's still going on now, like advertising's obsession with the world's first this, the world's first that.
Yeah. Totally.
Which I think is just kind of like this media narrative that goes on. But I was like, rather than just look for these brand new things that no one's ever seen before and this obsession with new, what happens if you look backwards in order to look forwards? So an example of that is the search engine I made, the alternative to Google, based on the principles of Socratic questioning. So it's like a 3,000-year-old search engine. And Socrates being seen as the father of Western philosophy, and his Socratic method of when you ask a question, you can ask it from lots of different directions. So I made a search engine based on that. So you type in a question, and rather than like Google, you just press one button and get a list of replies. You type in the question, then you choose how you want to ask the question. So you could view evidence on that question. You could consider the implications of it. You could challenge your assumptions. You could seek alternatives, and another kind of few examples. You go at it in lots of different ways, and that's an example of kind of looking backwards to look forwards.
That's just making me think, as you're talking about that again. Like now, I'm watching with kids, and my kids, but just this whole idea of this where we're asking like bots questions all the time, and they're doing it with Siri and everything like that, But actually, again, this idea of where the need for critical thinking, the ability to really kind of think about this information that you're getting, and therefore the type of questions you're really wanting to, the type of information you're really searching, feels really, really key or really important. This stuff,
and I think especially around climate narratives and things as well. And you just consider the difference of the lens that you're looking at this thing through will show you a different type of answer. And especially around plurality now as well, and kind of a lot of the issues faced with a kind of a very scientific solution to this thing, and implications on kind of the non-developed world, and extreme carbon injustice, and kind of just saying everyone has to come out of carbon economies all at the same time, when there's certain countries that have reaped the spoils of that for centuries now and done quite well out of it. But just looking at the questions from different angles will get you to different answers. And that alone, not just the fact that you will see different answers and you can interpret those in different ways, but just the fact, the appreciation that, again, like we started with, the difference between absolute and relative.
Yeah. It's making me think, actually, that search, and you're talking back to Socrates and accessing, wisdom or ancient knowledge or thinking. I think it was yesterday. I could be wrong on this, but I think I was reading a thing on looking at the bushfires in Australia, and there was something I saw about how, and again, I'll need to clarify this, but I think what I saw from it was that there were parts of the country that have not been affected by the fires, and where Indigenous Aboriginal people are still very much involved in the decision making around land usage and everything, whereas a lot of the places where the fires are out of control, they've just been stripped of that kind of knowledge. So, they see the land's very much being, seen as a resource extraction and clearing forests and mining and all this kind of stuff. So you're sort of creating these conditions. But it's just fascinating for me, again, that sort of, because I think this idea of, I've talked about this before in another an episode again about this always looking forward, the newness, and almost this idea of when we try and go back and think what could we learn from other types of thinking, particularly when we go back long time thinking, really long time thinking. There is this, in this kind of shiny, fast industrial world, almost quite often a sense of what can that tell us? Do you know what I mean? But it's all in front of us. The knowledge. So I'm really interested in that at this moment in time. Again, how might we be able to start to open up that and start to sort of work more with information from other times?
Or even the different types of knowledge embedded in that. One of the books, or the book I'm reading at the minute that I brought along, is called How the World Thinks by Julian Baggini. And it's a history of the world philosophy, and basically he's arguing that philosophy as we largely know it is Western philosophy, and it's kind of written and rational, but that has limits, and it's not the only type of philosophy. There's Eastern philosophy, or there's indigenous philosophy, and there's philosophies from different cultures and different parts of the world. But one of the points he makes is that kind of embedding philosophy in written language and rationality gives it a limit. There's kind of only so far it can go. And he uses the example of Japanese philosophy and how that's embedded in action and ritual a lot of the time. So things like taekwondo and flower arranging, or kind of raking gravel. There's philosophy embedded in those actions. Right. And just because it's not written doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Or even like a podcast like this is an example of kind of philosophy or conversation or knowledge being captured in a different way to the published word, and things being published in book. And I think that's quite telling, kind of the popularity of podcasts at the minute, that people seem open to different forms of access to knowledge.
We live on a life-giving rock called Earth, hurtling through space. How bonkers is that? If you like what you're hearing, please do give us a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps others find the show.
Have you come across David Abraham's work? He wrote a book called Spell of the Sensuous, which talks a little bit as well about the evolution of the written word from an oral tradition to written words, and he actually plots that as a kind of he's exploring very much again a sort of our connection to an animate living Earth that was there as we evolved as humans for most of our history, and then he plots the kind of the written word as a key moment of disconnection. And from the ability, because obviously you were building your understanding of the world through connection to the non-human world, through oral passing of information, through sound, through all kinds of other intelligence. That then obviously when you write. When you start writing, even as a youngster, it can be very frustrating trying to write a story, because it's like it becomes down to like a few words that you know what I mean? Versus if you watch children, imagining and playing acting, and expressing stories through oral forms, it's deep, rich, and complex, and do you know what I mean? And, so it's I think this stuff is so interesting right now, and how do you make it accessible? So I guess I'd love to dig into some of your projects, and I'd love to, obviously I'm erring towards, you've been doing quite a lot around the climate crisis and the climate and ecological situation recently. I'd love to talk about Circa Solar, because that's I backed it on Kickstarter, so I want to know about that. No, but I love it. And can you just tell us about it? Like, where did it come from, and how does it work, and what's it all about, and what prompted it?
So it started again with like a single moment. So it was while I was at the Royal College of Art, and I was just sat in the canteen quite early on. My professor came and sat next to me. And I was like, oh my God, because he's very erudite and he's very respected. And I was like, what do I say here in this situation? But we just started getting in a conversation about perspective for some reason. And he was talking about how perspective in architecture, there's lots of different ways of rendering it. So you've kind of got the single vanishing point. So imagine you're stood on train tracks and they kind of seem like they're meeting in the distance, even though they're not. And that's the very classic one that we know. But then there's loads of different other versions of kind of opening vanishing points, fisheye lens, X, Y, Z. And that kind of raised the question in my head that if we can take these different perspectives of how we perceive space, is the same true as time? And I just did this small project, and it was called 10 times time. So the number 10 X time, and it was just 10 different ways that we can perceive time based on doing a brief bit of research into it, and there were illustrations. I just did that as a small project while I was at the Royal College of Art. And then I revisited it a couple of years later while I was at Somerset House Studios. And then I wanted to do it to embed those same ideas into something that was more common to how we perceive time. So there were watch faces, clock faces, because the problem I had before, people were like, they got the idea, but it only went so far. So I was like, well, what's the blockage there? It's because we all perceive time as we're taught it in school and as is all around us in culture, the clock and the watch face. So I just took that circular design or circular framework constraint and put these alternative notions in there. And that was a project called Sense of Time. And I did loads of them. There was about 30 of these designs, but then it got funded by King's College to make some prototypes. I was working with a professor of philosophy from King's College London. So we made 10 of them as working prototypes, which should then go on display. And of those 10, there was one that seemed to resonate more with people, and they just got instantaneously, which was what I'm calling Circa Solar Now. And it's basically just divides the day up into day and night with sunrise and sunsets, but it does it automatically, so it will look to where you are on the world, because we've all got kind of different day lengths and night lengths wherever we are in the world and where we are in the seasons, and it will render those. But then one of the key things that it did, it had like a single hand which went round once in 24 hours as opposed to 12 hours, and that hand was black. And because the nighttime was black, when it gets into night, the hand essentially disappears and you don't know what time it is. And that was based on a Dave Eggers quote from the book The Circle, that we are delicately calibrated between the clarity of day and the mystery of night, and between the and the unknown. And then we need that balance of not knowing. We shouldn't know absolutely everything. So I took that design and then made it into a Kickstarter project in order that it could kind of be released on the App Store, because before they were just closed prototypes. So I made a whole Kickstarter project on that, and luckily got the back-in, you being one of them. And now it's out in the world.
I mean, there's a lot in this idea.
Yeah.
There's a lot, and there's a lot that really intrigues and interests me on so many levels. One is like this idea. I mean, you've used this the phrase, the first redesign of time since 1761.
Yeah.
What happened in 1761 then? Is that
that was when the Longitude Prize was won.
Right.
So it was the first essential timekeeper that could keep time anywhere in the world. And that's when time and space kind of really became conjointed. Discovery of the New World, colonialism, quantification of everything all happened then. But if you look at basically every watch face that you can get on your Apple Watch or your iPhone, it's just a duplication of that 1761 design. We haven't gone any further since then. Like the clock literally stopped ticking for time at that point. But there's still so many different versions of time. That's not like I think people get confused and think that's the objective version of time, that we reached out almost like a scientific experiment when something's discovered. But it was just what it achieved with consensus, basically, that everyone was agreed that it works for its purpose of telling a universal global time.
Because it's one thing I find such as because it challenges this big story this idea of time and clocks.
One of the two metaphysical dimensions we live in,
right?
Space and time.
And so the idea that you actually, again, and I think again in this sort of the times we're living in right now, where we sort of, there's a sense that we need to challenge a lot of kind of very, very fixed stories on so many levels.
Yeah.
So this idea of time is fascinating, and I guess the other thing that I find really interesting about it is going back to our sort of ancient being, our ancient selves, as creatures, our relationship with the world and particularly with the sun, and so these, when the ideas you're playing with. So tell me about, you started using. I mean, how have you, because you were experimenting, right, with your own self using this new notion of time. Tell us a bit about that, because I imagine it must have been pretty interesting.
This is where I start to sound like a bit of a nut. It was almost LSD-esque, having this time, this thing that I designed for one purpose, and there was all of the kind of, I did the research and all of the rational things that might be changed because of it, but then there's like the lived experience of being around it, which was something entirely different. So what I found was this kind of feeling. You weren't
very good at turning up for meetings.
Yeah. No, I still do that. I kind of only 4 minutes late today. But actually the de-acceleration time was one of them. So we live in a very accelerated culture where everything gets faster, faster, faster. The living in this very kind of natural circadian rhythm version of time, daylight, sunrise, sunset, just slowed everything down for me. An example of that and how it might affect our relationship to climate crisis was recently I went out to, there was a conference in Zurich called the Daylight Academy, and lots of top scientists in the world researching themes of daylight now, and just almost seeing this as one really underexplored area of science that touches on so many different kind of human biology, animal living world, philosophy, energy production, architecture, like all of these different fields can be brought together in it. So they're having this conference in Zurich, and by default I was invited to go. So I looked at flights and I was like, why am I flying there when a lot of my work's exploring climate crisis and trying to slow this stuff down? So then I just did an alternative search on what a train journey would be. And it was, 8-9 hours from King's Cross over to Zurich with a change in Paris. And I thought that'd be really nice to sit on a train for 8 hours with a book and look out the window and have that slow journey, rather than this, what is a construct as well, the idea that the flight is 90 minutes, but that's 90 minutes from when the airplane's wheels take off on one runway to touch another. You get all of the transit through the airport, get into the airport, the customs, everything else that comes with it. But the
£800 you spend on your way through.
Exactly, yeah, all of those things. But the construct that the airplane travel is the fastest travel isn't true, or even
on the way.
Yeah, the most pleasurable form, like the way that you're crammed in. And actually, once you get into Europe as well, I'm feeling like how much they invest in their train infrastructure. Like the train I got from Paris to Zurich is like a double decker and like really big windows you could look out of, and
amazing.
Like really good Wi-Fi as well. The buffet
they have
car,
like windows in the roofs and stuff.
yeah, and the sense of community as well. Like people would go in there for business meetings and kind of like coming over, having chats across chairs, and everyone's very considerate of each other. There's a different kind of space. So that was one thing. It de-accelerated me. So now I'm kind of almost in that as a mode by default. Do I just always have to do the quickest journey from A to B? But kind of more on an existential level was a connection with nature as a whole. So when you start researching kind of our relationship to daylight, you find that sets our circadian rhythms, which are really important to us. But nearly all living organisms have got their own circadian rhythm. There's only kind of a few creatures that live in deep caves or the deep sea that don't have kind of circadian rhythms set by daylight, but then they have an indirect relationship to them in that if you're a deep sea creature, you're feeding off of the animals that have died above that have had circadian rhythms that then die and float down. But there's this commonality with nature that we share in being circadian beings, that once I started using this version of time, I felt something in common with the pot plant in my studio, that we both had these kind of rhythms that were set by daylight and nothing to do with numbers. Like time is not a numerical phenomenon. and that level of kind of a shared reality really opened me up to a lot of kind of empathy with the living world and respect for it, or kind of duty of care for it as well, or even the rhythms of kind of the cycles of growth and dormancy. The boat's in Victoria Park at the minute, and I walked through there this morning, and all of the trees don't have any leaves on them, but they're not dead; they're just dormant. And I think that
and there's a lack of sun around, and there's
exactly. And it's their evolutionary strategy for survival is to go into dormancy to survive winters, and then come back to life in spring, and then start photosynthesis because there's more sun. But this kind of exponential growth curve that we're stuck on, I think a way out of that isn't just pure degrowth. It's kind of these cycles of growth, dormancy, which are reflected in nature and proven by evolution to work, that maybe we should start to be reflecting those more and kind of just slow down a bit in winter, and kind of people's opening hours to decrease and energy consumption, and then go up in summer.
Absolutely. I mean, I love this because it's totally about moving into relationship with life as it is. And so, again, this idea, I think it's always absolutely just fried my head constantly, is this mad sort of Q1, Q2, Q3 mentality.
Yeah.
So like by the last quarter of the year, everyone's fried, right? Just still trying to get this growth right out of it. Whereas like look outside the sort of crazy human world, and you'll see everything else slowing down, and realize, and so that growth thing, that will come. So you're sort of preparing for the sort of the period of kind of, the period of exponential growth will be spring, summer, So, and lo and behold, that's when we have more light, right?
Yeah,
so
and people are more happy to work in the evenings or start earlier, or they've got more vitamin D, they've got more energy.
There's a reason why you don't want to get out of bed when it's dark. Right?
Yeah. No, my friend Jay Paul suffers from seasonal affective disorder, the so-called SAD syndrome, and he has got a really interesting notion that it's not a disorder. It's just natural. To feel lower in winter is what a tree's doing when it goes into dormancy. It's just a natural phenomenon, and it's kind of society that's programmed us that we need to be performing 11 out of 10.
Yeah, and would you actually feel okay if you weren't being asked to be pulled out into frenetic pace and order and because actually maybe that sort of embodied intelligence that we have around what how we feel about the shift in daylight or temperature and all these things. That's deep intelligence from a long from years.
And another thing I found as well was kind of the relationship, the types of work I was doing or research I was doing, and again based on that Dave Eggers quote that we're carefully calibrated between the clarity of day and the mystery of night. So what I then started to find was that in winter, when the evenings are longer, I'd be exploring work that was more narrative, mystery based. And then in summer, when there's a lot more light around, I was far more happier consuming kind of scientific, kind of objective knowledge, and then having the shifts between those two things as well, rather than just pursuing one route all year. And then that's kind of, you can tie that back to ancient behaviors of the purpose of narrative at nighttime when we used to sit around fires telling stories, and how kind of the exploration of mystery in nighttime is really innate to the human experience, and we will come together as communities at night because we feel less safe because the saber-toothed tiger has got more advantages on its side in the dark. So we'll form as communities around fires and explore storytelling when we can't see as far, so our imagination is more open to these things.
And now, I guess on top of the time dimension, we've also added all of this light, artificial light, be it through screens and always on media. And because there's been quite a lot of research into like people that are working through like natural artificial light, right? So when you have artificial lights on in the evening, or people that are working shifts in the night, that's starting to impact kind of chronic stress-related illness and all kinds of stuff, which are sort of out of sync again with this natural rhythm.
Yeah, well, the research there showing that it's one of the, again, really underexplored areas, but one of the most dangerous things that you can do to the human body other than filling it full of sugar and kind of pushing it towards diabetes and obesity or nicotine is to mess about with circadian rhythms, circadian systems, because they're very delicately calibrated, and we've got like 100 to 200,000 year evolution just as Homo sapiens behind us, let alone everything before that, that's always aligned to the sun. And then this really recent phenomenon after the Industrial Revolution, which is only a few hundred years in, where we're just overriding it. But yeah, people being forced into kind of night shift work or sitting under artificial light where it's not kind of calibrated to the right degrees, or they even found it with smartphones. We're pumping blue light into our retinas late into the light, and we associate subconsciously blue light with daytime, with mornings, and that's why it upset our sleep patterns. And it was only in the last few years that Apple and Android have introduced night shift, where they phase the light towards kind of the warmer red spectrum, the backlighting of it, to help us kind of into sleep patterns.
So how is that? How do you have people? Do you hear from it? Are people experimenting with with this Circa Solar? How's it? Do you have any sense of people trying to play with it in their own lives? Is it too early to tell?
The anecdotal feedback's been positive. Yeah, a lot of people have said it's changed their relationship to time and to kind of the importance of sunrise and sunset. It's found its way into an exhibition at Somerset House at the minute called 24/7, which is it's based on a book by Jonathan Crary of the same name, 24/7, which critiques late-stage capitalism and what he calls the ends of sleep. The sleep used to be kind of the last bastion when we weren't affected by people selling us stuff and capitalism's kind of reign. But now with our smart devices sending us pinging messages and people waking up in the night to check them, or the expectations of work cultures to have people in always on communication, that your boss can send you an email at 9 p.m. at night and expect an answer, or you've got so much work to do you'll take your laptop home and carry on working, that there's an infiltration in that. So yeah, there's people kind of adopting it in that lens, or just on a very kind of basic level, just the idea that you can challenge the 24-hour day and this idea of hours, minutes and seconds, which are complete constructs. There's nothing scientific or objective about them. It's just a narrative we bought into. And people, that kind of seems to unlock something in someone's head, that you can challenge it, that of course it's not a science.
Just an idea.
Yeah. Or it's kind of this beat that we've organise ourselves around, but there's lots of different beats that we can organise ourselves around, which kind of the analogies to music aren't kind of unintentional there. But the other thing that I say about Circa Solar is kind of realigning yourself with the nature of time, that the sunrises and sunsets that affect our circadian systems are apparent and observable. And that's what science tells us to do, is kind of measure ourselves on things that can, or align ourselves to things that can be measured and you can observe and quantify, and anyone can observe them in the same way. So if anything, that version of time is more objective than the quantified one.
It's super interesting. My friend of mine, Eski Britton, who I've had done a couple of podcasts with over the past, I mean, she's one of her inquiries is around lunar relationships, and to the same thing. I mean, she's looking deeply at that relationship on lots of different dimensions. But one of the things, as you were talking, reminded me, because she was saying how she now plots her time, her work projects, against the kind of trajectory of the moon across the month. So she knows at certain phases, this is a time where she needs to go in on herself. This is a time where she's not great at collaboration work. This is a time when she's at her most creative, and that's when she sort of schedules in those kind of pieces of work. And she's been collecting a lot of data around this. And it's, and I guess there's the tidal time as well, which is sort of interesting for people that sort of more have that connection to tides.
Well, the tidal time's caught with the lunar time as well. It's the moon that's pulling the tides through its gravity. So all of those things are linked. But that's actually the bigger plan for this is the Circa Solar, which is around daylight relationships, day-night, in a 24-hour period. But the next one I've got in mind would be Circa Lunar, which is the calendar and the yearly, monthly cycle. and to make an app based around that. And then the final one could be Circa Flora, where there's floral clocks have been explored in the past more for their aesthetic purposes in kind of like church greens and things like that. But the flowering of flowers and seasons, again, for indigenous cultures, that would signify time and things to points in a year when we would go about doing something, or they'd put meaning on top of that. So that would become the kind of the signals in a way, but for a reason that kind of, because those plants are natural, they only start flowering when the conditions around them are right. And then that relates back to the climate crisis.
Because we've got
we're pushing it all out of sync
in January.
Exactly, yeah. So all of those rhythms are coming out of sync. So those cultures that have been observing that for centuries now are becoming out of sync. But then they're noticing it, and that's their interpretation of climate change. Rather than just looking at all these graphs and numbers, it's the flowers are doing different things, or they used to, these ones come out at the same time as these ones, but now those ones aren't coming out at all, and these ones do it early, X, Y, Z. So it's experienced and lived observation of it, which I think should be far more explored, or even our subconscious level, living in cities, we can pick those things up.
It's absolutely brilliant. It's fascinating. You've got, I'd say you're quite prolific. You have a lot of, you always have stuff you're doing. You put stuff out in the world quite
much sometimes.
But tell me a little bit more about these other kind of climate related things that you've been doing over the last year. There was this weather map thing that you were doing, wasn't it? The weather and climate, and what? Just tell me how these things, where they're coming from, and what's.
Well, there's people listening to that, I think it's a planted thing, but it was the your Fridays for the Future. So you remember your video you made, like the call to arms?
My rant.
Yeah. So the kids are doing Fridays for the Future, right. And then you did Fridays for the Future for everyone. So you don't just have to be a teenager or a school striker to join these things.
Amazing.
Or you don't even have to be on the streets. And I was doing bits and pieces around climate for that, either kind of explicitly or implicitly. But then when I saw that, I was like, right, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do Fridays for the Future, or I'm going to do at least one day a week, even if it's not a Friday because of work commitments or whatever else.
A 20% rule of thumb.
And I just started doing these little mini projects.
Amazing.
That sometimes it would be 2 Fridays or 3 Fridays in a way, or it'd sum up to something, or sometimes it would just be one. Like the last one I did, the climate triage, which is based on a quote I read by Chris Packham in The Observer, where he was like saying, our job at the minute is triage. So it's kind of diagnosing what we got left of the living world to get to the operating theatre and kind of get us through this next few years. And I thought it was a really interesting analogy to compare it to triage in kind of like medical emergency situations. So I looked at how that's done, and it's kind of like this algorithm of table yes/no answers, and I did a version of that for climate. So a lot of them are just like really small projects, but then I put them on my website and I put them on Instagram and see how they go. But one that got quite a lot of traction was around the idea of linking climate to weather and how they're just the same thing, but through different lenses. And it starts to come back. So that came from the time project that I was doing, and I was talking to a climate scientist about it and our kind of perspectives, interpretations of time. And I thought it was really interesting because as a climate scientist, we define the difference between climate and weather is days. So if you think of Friday, Saturday and Sunday, if Friday's raining, Saturday's overcast and Sunday's sunny, that's not proof of climate change. That's just the weather getting hotter over 3 days. But for climate data, it's 30 years, periods of 30 years. If you can take an average temperature for 1900, 1930, 1960, 1990, and it's going up, you've got proof, scientific proof that global warming's happening. So I thought that was really interesting. These two different ways of looking at the same thing get you to different places, and how, again, as we've spoken about, are very short-termist Western view of the world, just thinking in quarters or years, that we don't think in 30 years is a lot of time for us, let alone centuries or millennia. So what had happened if you paired the two up? And I was looking through the Observer one week, and I saw the weather report on the final page, and the Guardian just started doing the carbon readings from that little island in Hawaii, and they just put it in there as raw information. And it's really hard to kind of understand what it means. It's good that they've started doing it, but it's hard to understand what its significance, because as humans, we like narratives. So I just sketched up a speculative design for an alternative weather report that a newspaper might use, where you get kind of a 3-day forecast, but then you also get a 90-year forecast. So it shows you on this day in 30 years what the weather might be like. And if we have temperature increases, then it's going to be really hot.
It's very striking, right? Because it's... I thought that was so interesting, and there was you got some interesting engagement around it
in social media. It got quite a lot of traction, and there's a lot of movement around longer term thinking. There's Long Now Foundation, and a lot of other people in the climate arena looking at that.
There's Ella. Do you know Ella Saltmarsh? But she has this collaboration she's on. It's the Long Time Project.
Yes.
Again, looking at kind of how do we...
I think, I got a retweet out of them.
Shifting this... Again, how do we shift this narrative in our culture of away from this, my life, this moment, to almost sort of, to the phrase, I can't remember who it was that talked about, can we be good ancestors? Sort of...
That's Roman stuff, isn't it?
Right.
So he's got a new book coming out on that idea of good ancestors as well, just thinking ourselves as we are passing the baton on,
right?
And what a future generation is going to make of us, and probably not a lot at the minute, the way we're going.
Well, Robert McFarlane's been talking about this in recently about, again, this sort of this moment in time of being what a time for legacy, because a responsibility as well, because it's very clear now, probably for the first generation, where it's very clear what we're potentially leaving behind. A bloody mess. And so this whole sense of good ancestry and responsibility as a species is sort of very kind of
and asking what people are going to think of us.
Right.
Like, we are so status obsessed and so caught up in our individualistic narratives that a lot of the time is based on people immediately around us and in our social media circles, and if they respect us, or if we go and give talks and everyone quotes us and XYZ. But what if people haven't even been born yet?
Right.
How do they respect us? And then how does that make us feel about our status if they think that we're an absolute joke, that we had all of the tools at our disposal, all the information was there, and we were just so literally living like there's no tomorrow. So that project was exploring a lot of those things. And another key thing that kind of came up to me, or maybe why it resonated with people, was the idea of domesticating this information and this thinking about the climate crisis and bringing it into everyday conversation and everyday narratives. It is a bit decoupled when it is in the IPCC reports and it's just graphs going up. And the weather is something that we engage with, and as in Britain particularly, we're obsessed with weather and conversations about weather, or checking weather reports. I checked it before I came to meet you today, see if I needed my umbrella. But if you then put climate in the same space, it forces people to appraise it. And the other idea with it as well is that if that climate and level report was just speculating about this day in history in 30 years, it changes it on a daily basis. So it's not always as, it's going to be 1.5, 1.7 for the whole of that year and that decade. And it's just this single kind of thing. If you think of it could change. You could say London's like Barcelona in April today, which again, there's reports showing that we're moving. If we carry on like this, London will have the same climate as Barcelona. So then you can just take what Barcelona's weather report is for today and put that on top of London and see how that looks and feels a bit alien, but that's what it would be like. Yeah. And then people can imagine, right, in 30 years, I'll probably still be alive. I'm still in London. I'll be going out in Barcelona in April.
But that's challenging, isn't it? Because if in many ways, the average Londoner will probably be delighted that...
this is, problems we get to, isn't it?
We're going to become Barcelona, because at the moment we're jumping on planes to go to Barcelona. But I don't know, again, it's these, that's the thing, isn't it? And again, I guess for me, I'm always interested again in the sense of our sense of responsibility. What, we talk about, this whole thing of climate justice, and what we're doing, what we do here today has impacts everywhere. And our high emitting lifestyles are impacting those who've contributed the least, in other parts of the world. But
so that came out in the graphic that I did as well, that on the existing weather report, it has around the world at the bottom of it, and it's like key cities, and it shows what their temperature weather's going to be. So I took that and then projected into the future, and then found that it would be the so-called developing world or the global south, which is far more unevenly affected by this and gets far less of a pleasant output of it, kind of completely unlivable drought-esque conditions. So then I split that into kind of global north and global south. And then when you have kind of like a color-coded temperature rise on it, you can then see the implications where people think that it might just be a pleasant effect. And that's the whole narrative that Russia are going with at the minute, isn't it? Yeah. That this is actually going to be a good thing for agriculture.
Opportunities for us as a nation.
But then there's other cities that are really, really going to be, and then because of that, they might have to put more air conditioning in, so it just makes the whole thing exponentially worse and just carries on and on.
Yes.
So where to go from that?
So exactly. So well, we've got a little bit of a time constraint, which is talking about time. Which is if we were going by the Circa Solar, we could just keep pumping for another couple of hours. But
we've still got some daylight left.
I know, some good daylight to go. For what's coming up for you this year, like where can people check out some of your work? And tell me a little bit of anything that you can share about things coming up for you 2020.
So checking out the work, ted-hunt.com. I normally put things on as kind of the living archive, and that's very lots going on in kind of the way that I do these small experiments and then try to join dots between things.
I'll stick all of that in the show notes.
Yeah, and then on Instagram as well. I whenever I do something, I publish it to there, and that seems to be where it gets its most traction, really. Yeah. Twitter seems to be turning off for me at the minute for some reason. It's just not getting the engagement anymore. No. I don't know what that's all about.
No, failed to get me anywhere to record a podcast.
Yeah, everyone's becoming more visual maybe, or there's something, Twitter's just too political. In terms of work, the show at Somerset House where these projects are exhibited in is on till the end of the month, and that's a really interesting show actually, that critiquing kind of capitalism's relationship to time. There's not a lot of stuff that's explicitly to do with climate there, but there's a lot that implicitly you can really kind of sense these themes coming through and how artists are interpreting it. I'm going out to Barcelona to give a talk, a conference called Internet Age Media. I think that's the end of March, and that's around exploring the search engine stuff that I do. I did a workshop with them last year where I just took these notions of creating different search engines based on different philosophies, but then made it pluralist, so just made a template and then gave it out to a room full of 30 people and said, right, what principle would you base your search engine on? And what would be the variables? And then they wrote those in, and then we put them all on the wall and everyone spoke through it, and you just realize how many different perspectives on information and knowledge you can take. So I'm going to revisit that and hopefully build some of those up as narratives and kind of case studies and present those in Barcelona. The Circa Luna I'd really like to do as well, and just take the Circa Solar project a step on.
Yeah, you must do that. Sounds amazing.
I was reading about the decolonization of the calendar. So one of the things I said about Circa Solar is how it decolonizes time, and how this quantified version of time that was set in Greenwich and kind of is very kind of British Empire-esque and then was imposed on the rest of the world was a colonialist tool as much as it is anything else. And if you just take that for time as 24 hours, minutes, seconds, then the calendar has also got those things going on. So returning to the 13-month lunar calendar, and then living with that as well, and then seeing what that does to me, what that does to other people. And yeah, more Fridays for the future for everyone well.
I'm so chuffed you've done that, and that's brilliant, because I'm actually starting to write a little bit about this this kind of nudge out that could we start using, those of us who have the time, could we start using it more around the things that interest us to sort of, whether it's awareness raising or creative ways of engaging people, or whether it's ideas, whatever it might be, right? That's the whole point. It's just like, you've got young marchers out and striking, but there's so many ways that those that are sort of leaning into this problem could be doing stuff around it. So I'm delighted you've taken the baton. We're going to be sort of giving a big push on it into the into the spring to
Feel
try and
free to use any example.
I will.
But yeah, it does.
Totally.
I'd encourage people to do the same, almost not as a burden or a sense of they have to. It's when you do start thinking about it and exploring it, you realize like how much of the most challenging, but maybe the most interesting questions that humans have ever faced in a way are embedded within this, and how there's so many opportunities. Like you start looking into it, and it's easy to get weighed down by the dystopianness of it. But then when you start thinking about the utopian notion of like things could be different, and we could go towards these things, and there could be kind of like equality based in kind of global societies, and a far better relationship with the natural world where we see ourselves as a part of it, not apart from it, and what that world might look like.
I mean, I'm absolutely 100% with you. I mean, it's absolutely a time for curiosity and questions right now, and like working with those questions that you have. So super interesting. So look, thank you so much for the time for this.
No worries, it's great talking.
And I'm going to try and I'm going to challenge myself to use Circa Solar once we get out. Once the daylight starts increasing, I'm going to give myself a period of time where I actually try and play with it, because I think it's so interesting and it really cares. And all the stuff you do is amazing, and it's been a delight to have you here. And well, I'll share all your links and projects in the show notes. Just to close off, it's a question I often ask folks about, being on the spaceship Earth right now. What would your thought be to those who are kind of thinking that right now, like, this idea that we're all crew here. There are no passengers on this Earth. What would you say to that right now?
To me, my immediate response is slightly critical. I was watching an Adam Curtis documentary recently where he was being quite critical of the Buckminster Fuller. He's the Spaceship Earth, where it was being critical of it. It was thinking of the Earth as a spaceship, is thinking of it as a mechanism and a closed system, and one that humans have control of, and we are the crew, which kind of brought into my mind this idea that we're the crew, the humans, but what about the non-human crew?
They're currently the ones that are flying the ship.
Exactly, yeah, and the bacteria, exactly, because
the problem right now.
The problem, that we are.
The problem is we're the fucking passengers.
We think we're doing it, but we're just sending it towards the Death Star or into into ascent. So yeah, the idea would be around the non-human crew and the proportionality of it. Another thing that I found with my research on Circa Solar was that of all of the biosphere on Earth, humans make up 0.01%, non-humans are 99.99%. So then I made a visual of that, and if you put like a 1 pixel graphic on your laptop screen in front of you, you just see, and that represents humans, and then you make a circle for non-humans, you just see the edge of it on the corner of your screen, and the entire size of it would probably be the same as you standing up. And that's our proportionality. But everything we seem to talk about, everything that's in our newspapers and books, is concerned with issues inside that pixel. And I think the more that we can think of this other, the non-human, which is far, far bigger than us, but we're a part of it as well. And I think that's the overlap between, like the Venn diagram bit. If we put our pixel on top of that, and that's what Circa Solar is trying to do as well, just think of us, all these living organisms, as having circadian beings. We've got something in common with them, and we're shared, and we're not apart from them. We're a part of this thing. So yeah, the spaceship Earth as everything and everyone.
Yeah, I love that. And chimes in. The sort of idea I'm trying to explore is this idea of becoming crew, i.e. what can we learn from all the non-human crew that are currently really creating the conditions for life.
Yeah.
And how do we step into that? How do we actively sort of like, what's my role in this now? But
definitely.
Ted, thank you. Good luck, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you, listeners.
So I hope you enjoyed that conversation with the marvellous Ted Hunt. I mean, what a legend, eh? We could have chatted, and I think we'll do another one down the line for sure. Check Ted's work out. I guarantee we're going to hear a lot from Ted this year. I'll put links in the show notes, but he's just, incredible mind and ability to express through these different ways of thinking and seeing and feeling the world around us. I just love Circa Solar. Like, imagine, I mean, that would be an experiment, right? Like what would happen if we just all binned our watches for a couple of weeks and all shifted to Circa Solar time? Do you know what I mean? Circa solar time, all operating off that beautiful thing that Ted's created, tuning in to our sort of deep ancient circadian rhythm, navigating our daily lives through the sun itself and light and dark. I think that would be extraordinary. I mean, I'm going to do that myself. I'm working with the app. I'm actually going to do some stuff, mainly at the moment around kind of weekends, but I'd like to actually do a bit of experimentation. So who's up for that? Let's make that happen. Wouldn't that be cool? Could we get a whole town on circa solar time? Or a city? Imagine a country on circa solar. Maybe that's going a bit too far, too quick. But I just love the idea of that, of shifting to a different way of connecting into the rhythm of this beautiful planet, the spaceship Earth. So thanks a lot for listening. Just quickly as well, I have to say Ted mentioned the Friday Future Love, which was lovely and quite flattering to hear that my rambling rant from May on YouTube, which I'll link to if you're interested, inspired Ted to up his output around climate. But Friday Future Love is a simple idea. It's just this idea of the wonderful kids and inspired by Greta Thunberg are out striking on the streets, and what could we do on a Friday which didn't necessarily involve striking, but it could involve using our sort of talents and energies to do stuff. It's around a sort of innovation day for the planet at large, where we take collective action to reimagine and redesign our modern human operating systems into something more regenerative and beautiful and life-sustaining. So if you're interested in taking part in that, we're upping the tempo on fridayfuture.love. You can sign up on fridayfuture.love, and we'll be getting some stuff going in February. Yes, mass participation to redesign the world. We like that. So thanks for listening. If there's brought any questions or ideas or things that have surfaced during this episode, please do reach out. Always up for hearing from everyone. You can get me at dan@thespaceship.earth or on Instagram at thespaceship.earth. We have a newsletter now, which you can sign up to on a monthly basis. You can find that on the site on thespaceship.earth. Get some updates from us on what's going on in this world. But thanks a lot for listening. If you like what you're hearing, please share an episode. Please give it a rating on Apple Podcasts or a review or just a bit of love. Love, it won't take you long, take a few seconds, but it all helps. It all helps others find the podcast. So thanks a lot for listening. Really appreciate you tuning in. Remember, folks, there's no passengers on Spaceship Earth. We're all crew. Let's make 2020 an enormous year of crew-like behaviour. Until next time, peace and out.